Tulle, Trulle, Mulle and Mr. Grumpy. Today I'm going to tell you about the day when Tulle, Trulle and Mulle met Peter's father, Mr. Jacobson, who was the bank manager in the village. Now I'm sure you remember what happened to Peter when he met the skeleton at the school, and it was after that incident that Tulle, Trulle and Mulle decided to visit Peter in his home. He had somehow become so different after what had happened. Now he looked after the smaller children in school, and if someone was just the slightest unkind to others, he was immediately there to help. The other two big boys didn't understand a thing, but if they were to be completely honest, they liked the new Peter much better than the old one. Peter also liked himself a lot better now, and Tulle, Trulle and Mulle were of course very happy. Now they wanted to visit Peter and his family to see how things were there. This morning Tulle, Trulle and Mulle woke up as they always did, with a good and happy feeling in their tummies. It's such a lovely tickling sensation that comes when you just know that the day will become like a fairy tale. The three troll girls were having a wonderful time at the breakfast table. They laughed and talked with their mom and dad before they said goodbye and set off walking through the woods. Tulle, Trulle and Mulle loved to walk in the forest, and lately the trees had begun to change color. Many were still green, but some had begun to turn yellow and orange, red and brown. The three troll girls knew that they would soon celebrate the great leaf fall party together with everyone in the big troll family in the forest, and they were really excited at the thought of it. I will tell you more about that another time. Tulle, Trulle and Mulle had a great time watching the kids all day, and when school was over, they followed Peter to his home. He went up to his room straight away and sat there almost all afternoon, struggling with his maths homework. The three troll girls looked at him as he sat there and felt quite sorry for him. When dinner was ready, his mum, Marie, called from downstairs, and he went down to the rest of his family. His big sister Bettina was already sitting at the table, studying her nails carefully. His mum was setting the table, and his father was sitting at the end of the table, reading a newspaper. "How's the maths homework going?" Mr. Jacobson continued to read the newspaper and didn't look up. Peter wasn't exactly happy. Every night his father checked his maths homework. "Well, it's not going so well." "No? What does that mean?" Now Mr. Jacobson removed the newspaper and looked at Peter with a grumpy face. Peter looked down. "I don't know how to. It's difficult." Something happened then that Tulle, Trulle and Mulle had never experienced before. Mr. Jacobson slammed down the newspaper and gave Peter a long and grumpy speech. If it had been him who had been so stupid when he was a boy, he would never have become anything, and if Peter didn't start pulling himself together, he would never get an education, and he would become a loser for the rest of his life. And so he continued. Peter sat quietly and listened to his father. His mother looked very tired. She smiled gently at Peter a few times, but said nothing. Tulle, Trulle and Mulle, however, got sterner and sterner expressions on their faces the more Mr. Jacobson spoke. What a grumpy man, and how awful for his family! When Tulle, Trulle and Mulle went home that afternoon, they decided to help Mr. Jacobson a bit. They would join him at work in the bank the next day. When Mr. Jacobson, who was in a good mood, showed up at work the next day, Tulle, Trulle and Mulle were there too. but no one else could see them, of course. Mr. Jacobson wore a suit and tie and fine black newly polished shoes. That's how you dress when you are a bank manager. Do you know what a bank is? Well, it's a place where you save your money in something called a bank account, and it's also a place where you can borrow money if you want to buy a car or a house or something other expensive things. You've probably heard the adults talk about money. Often adults talk about money, about not having enough and about how expensive everything is. I also do that sometimes, so it's probably quite normal. The day at the bank started with a morning meeting. Everyone who worked in the bank would look at figures and calculations on a large screen and discuss matters that had something to do with the bank. Mr. Jacobson was standing by the screen with his laptop while the others sat around a large table with their papers and briefcases. "Good morning, everyone. We'll soon be ready to start." Mr. Jacobson smiled and the others nodded and smiled back. Trulle was standing right next to Mr. Jacobson, and when it was all quiet, she made a long, loud, farting sound with her mouth. I'm sure you remember that Trulle is very good at making all kinds of funny voices and sounds. Tulle and Mulle can also do this, but Trulle is very good at it. Everyone in the room looked surprisingly at Mr. Jacobson. What was that? The bank manager turned around quickly. The others smiled, a little embarrassed. As you know, letting out a fart can happen to even the best of us, and the best thing you can do is to pretend nothing happened and carry on as before. It was not me. Now Mr. Jacobson looked quite perplexed. The others around the table looked down into their papers and some searched their briefcase, because if there is something which is really embarrassing, it is that someone lets out a fart and others hear it. But if there is something even more embarrassing than that, it is if someone says that it was not them, although everyone knows that's not true. I'm sure you know what I mean. Now Trulle made another farting sound with her mouth. It was even longer and louder than the first, and everyone at the table stared with mouths wide open. Who did that? Mr. Jacobson jumped quickly to the side. It wasn't me. Who's farting in here? Now he stared sternly and suspiciously at the others around the table. Maybe you didn't think that this could get any more embarrassing than it already was. But yes, because if there is anything which is even more embarrassing than to let out a fart, it is to start blaming others when everyone knows that it is you. After the meeting, Mr. Jacobson went into his office and closed the door behind him. He sat down at his desk and stared blankly into space. He had let out 5 long, loud farts at the meeting, and everyone had believed that it was him. What's going on? Mr. Jacobson hid his face in his hands and mumbled a little to himself. Tulle, Trulle and Mulle were standing around his desk, and now all 3 of them made lots of farting sounds, and it sounded as if the room was full of farts. Now Mr. Jacobson got tears in his eyes. But what on earth? What's going on? Who are you?
We are grumpy farts, you inner grumpy fart voice.
Trulle spoke with a grumpy fart voice, and Tulle and Mulle held their hands over their mouths so they didn't laugh out loud. But that's not possible. My inner voice? What do you want?
We want you to apologize to Peter You shouldn't say that he is stupid just because he finds mathematics difficult. Many people find maths difficult. You should help him with his maths homework and talk nicely to him and behave properly."
"Oh, okay, but how do you know all this?"
"Inner voices always know these things."
Trulle sounded pretty stern. Okay, I see. I think I'm sorry." Now Mr. Jacobson's eyes filled with tears, and he wiped them with his tie. Then he packed his things, put on his jacket, and went home. Everyone in the bank looked at him as he left, but he didn't even say goodbye. They thought maybe he had a bad stomach. That afternoon Mr. Jacobson was again sitting at the table behind the newspaper when the family gathered for dinner, but he didn't say anything, and when he all of a sudden put down his newspaper, the rest of the family got a huge surprise. Peter and Bettina almost fell off their chairs because, do you know what? Their father was wearing a red clown's nose and was smiling at them. "But Steve, dear, your nose, you're wearing a clown's nose." Their mother almost dropped the bowl of potatoes when she saw her husband. You probably know by now that Mr. Bank Manager Jacobson had a perfectly normal name and that it was Steve. "Yes, Marie, do you remember when we used to pretend we were clowns and played with the puppet show with the children?" Steve got up from his chair, helped his wife with the bowl of potatoes and put it on the table. Peter and Bettina looked at their father and could hardly believe their eyes and ears. Not only was Steve wearing a clown's nose, he also had big tears in his eyes. "I'm sorry I've been so grumpy. I'll stop being so grumpy." His family stared at him in utter surprise. "Oh, thank you, Steve." Now their mother had tears in her eyes too. Bettina and Peter looked at each other, and with great relief they all smiled together. And that was how it all began. That afternoon Peter's father helped him with his maths homework, and he apologized for all the unkind things he had said. If Peter himself hadn't experienced the thing with the skeleton a few days before, he would probably not have believed that this could be happening. But now he had almost begun to believe in miracles.